Even in an AI-focused world, MacroEdge is in the business of focusing on you. We don't just understand our clients, we listen to what's said and illuminate on what's not. In a world moving at the speed of light, with shifting markets, evolving workforces, and non-stop disruption, MacroEdge helps you to navigate and identify novel opportunities, expand your enterprise, and succeed in tomorrow's world. And it all starts with you. Put your enterprise and your perspective in the driver's seat. We're in the business of you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to MacroEdge Radio. This is John Galt speaking, and we are live Friday night, April 3rd, 2026. Tonight on X, we have a very special guest coming up. His name is Rory Johnston. I'm going to just read his bio real quick before we hit the numbers and discuss what has happened, because a lot has happened in 1 week since we last were here. And unfortunately, not all of it is good news. Rory is a Toronto-based oil market researcher. And if you need to understand how important he is to tonight's discussion and what's going on with the war, I started following him during the first war, the trade war, because there were implications as to what was occurring once we had Liberation Day that hit the oil markets that people didn't look at. And it hit a lot of the peripheral products and also the cost of transportation. Here we are now in a shooting war. We have WTI at 112. We have Brent at 109, but that's a different month. Keep that in mind. There's a difference right now. RBOB, unleaded gasoline wholesale, 327.9. The AAA national average is up to 409 today, and the diesel average is 540 to 551. What's happening is important because Rory, he founded Commodity Context, and he hosts the Oil Ground Up podcast. I would suggest you get a hold of that podcast and listen to his recent interviews discussing this. He wants us to pay attention to some of the granularity in the markets that you're not hearing about. We're going to address some of that tonight because everyone just looks at the prices and it says, oh my God. But the implications of taking this much oil off the market at the rapidity and the pace that we have is stunning. To give you an idea, and I'm going to bring Rory up here in just a second, the rate of change in WTI has been seen with spikes like this in other times in history. If these years sound familiar, someone stop me. 1987, 1990, 2000 to 2001, 2008, and 2022. Here we are again, and the rate of change is a ridiculous 91% roughly. And we're looking at a removal of barrels of inventory of just oil from the market globally. And the implications of this on the global economy, including the US, are going to be stunning. Rory, welcome to MacroEdge Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I look forward to hearing your commentary on this, because let's give some outlooks for some people to give a picture. I've read your summary of what you think would happen if we see the war ending by the end of April. But what happens if we go beyond this month with this much inventory being removed from the market and this much availability to fill the gaps? It's not there, is it?
That's right. So I think when you think about, let's just talk about if this war ends today, and what we're really talking about supply loss, because I think there's a lot of different numbers bouncing around. I think the main numbers that we should be watching right now are the volume of actual shut-in production in the Gulf countries. So these are the barrels that weren't able to be rerouted. So out of the total 20 million barrels a day of Hormuz flow that was blocked off, you were able to reroute kind of 6 to 7 million barrels a day of supply through alternative means. Some of that was Iran still getting its barrels out the strait. Those kept flowing more or less full pace, a little bit off, but pretty strong still. But the biggest offset was the Saudi East-West pipeline, which shifted those barrels from the Gulf over to the Red Sea. All in all, let's just be charitable and say 7 million barrels a day. So we're trying to be non-alarmist in the kind of most alarming way possible. There's still 13 million barrels a day of production offline in the Gulf. That's the barrels that are essentially accumulating as kind of absolute lost supply here. So in the first month of this conflict, we've probably lost upwards of 300 million barrels of production from the Gulf. That's between crude oil, natural gas liquids and condensates across the six main Gulf producers of Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain. When we keep going, if this continues, and I think now we're talking about, I think the base case now, kind of the most optimistic base case, is that the strait remains closed to the end of April, so that even if we assume, let's say we start turning things back on May 1st, because these things ramp up over time and it's going to take a matter of weeks or months to get everything back online, the total collective loss over that period of this new optimistic base case is 1 billion barrels, 1 billion with a B barrels that have been lost or will be lost from this market. Now, some people will say, like, okay, that's only like 10 days of demand, which is an entirely reasonable point. So I think when you think about the numbers here, we produce and consume roughly, let's say, 105 million barrels a day. Let's keep it easy. Math, 100 million barrels a day, because I think that basically paints the same picture. So yeah, 1 billion barrels is about 10 days of production or consumption in the world. We hold on any given day between inventories or total stocks in the system, roughly 8 billion barrels. But that includes all commercial inventories, merchant inventories, strategic inventories, oil on water, so every tanker on the ocean, oil and pipelines, all of this. And as you can hear by the kind of those things I'm listing, much of this is not really accessible stocks, but they're kind of functional needed stocks. The real functional stocks in the system are far, far lower than 8 billion barrels. And we're probably talking a couple billion barrels in the absolute max flex. This is a massive chunk of that. And I think that's the immediate loss that we now have to bake into the system. So no matter what, even in the most optimistic case now, we went into this crisis in an oversupplied market with kind of bearish price momentum and kind of heavy pressure on the downside. I wrote a bunch of pieces about how I was very bearish on the oil price outlook for this year and next on that fundamental outlook. This changes that fundamentally. One, we are unlikely to get back to a position of oversupply on the other side of this. But even in the most optimistic case, if we did, we've now unwound the past couple years of accumulated stock buildups and then some. We will end up in a lower stock position than we did on the other side of COVID. So I think this is a level of shock that we are either in, just again, in the most optimistic for the world perspective, just a much more bullish, kind of durable price environment for crude oil. And on the bad side, this gets so much worse because I think a lot of people think, and just to be clear, the current position is really terrible and untenable, but it can get so much worse. And I think what we can talk about is the ways that Iran has very purposely and very clearly left room for further escalation, whether or not that's the Houthis getting involved in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, or more directly taking direct fire at or kind of directly attacking the more kind of durable facilities and oil and gas infrastructure in the Gulf. We've seen in 2019 when that Iran can hit the massive Saudi Abqaiq facility, the largest oil processing facility on the planet. They can hit ports, they can hit other oil fields. And we've seen that they've taken this tit for tat kind of escalatory kind of counterattack strategy. So when the Israelis attacked the South Pars gas field, they immediately struck back at the Qatari Ras Laffan LNG facility. They have very clearly established that kind of escalatory counterattack pattern, and that's essentially put the U.S. military on notice, which is why they have pulled back from those attacks. But if we get to a stage where this further escalates and we don't wrap in a couple of weeks, and we do end up with boots on the ground, and the U.S. tries to take Karg Island, then yeah, you're going to hit a lot of stuff far more painfully and far more durably than we've seen. So I think the best case scenario is we're in a much firmer oil price environment, and the worst case scenario is that we really will truly speed run the worst oil prices in all of history.
With that being said, a lot of our audience, and I don't think you're that old to be quite honest. If I'm about speaking out of there, just tell me if I'm talking out of my hat. I'm an old guy. I remember the 70s, and a lot of people, yeah. And a lot of people don't understand the even odd concept. That'll be a fun one for them to learn in their lifetime.
Yeah.
I think that people need to prepare themselves for the possibility, because looking at what's happening, and I don't know if you've heard the news in the last hour, Trump's canceled all his press conferences, convened his national security team, and canceled trip to Mar-a-Lago for the Easter holidays. So it looks like we're getting ready to prepare for something else for them to spend the entire weekend in the White House. That's the bad case scenario you're referring to. But if we escalate trying to seize some of their outer and peripheral islands, which I still think is foolish, especially Karg Island, we look at what's going on with the Houthis, as you said. They still have the option to attacking Yanbu and hitting some of the VLCCs trying to come out of there, which would precipitate a larger crisis. I don't think people understand removing that 5 to 7 million barrels per day coming out of that region would actually accelerate the crisis globally, especially for Asia. Am I correct?
That's absolutely right. So I think that Saudi East-West pipeline, which, as you note, kind of kicks out on the industrial Saudi port of Yanbu in the Red Sea, is very vulnerable to the Houthis for obvious reasons. I think very recently that the Houthis were one of the main factors we were following as kind of a bullish supply side story in the oil market. And I think this is the challenge: is that they are obviously there and available, but they have thus far not escalated in the way that we could have seen them do thus far. They haven't attacked shipping. There has been one attack on the industrial port at Yanbu, the actual loading port, and a refinery there, but it hasn't risen to the stage of kind of taking the facility offline. And I think that that is one of those things that they're saving that as an option. And I do think that I had a recent podcast episode with Greg Brew at Eurasia Group, and he made the very wise point that the Houthis are not a proxy organization to the same degree that, say, Hezbollah is. Greg better described them as an ally. That they do have their own interests as well, and one of their interests is actually to kind of keep the Saudis kind of on side, because the Saudis are now giving them a lot of money, basically paying them off. But I think that will likely keep the Houthis from too easily getting involved in a full way of like actually closing the strait. The Bab el Mandeb Strait, not obviously the other strait here now. But if things do truly become existential for Tehran, I think that is when you will see the Houthis get involved. And as you know, 5 million barrels a day is that's a huge chunk of that kind of it's the vast majority of the rerouted oil. So that takes an absolutely existential crisis of 13 million barrels a day off the market and jacks it back up to 18, which is just, more of an awful thing. But I do think that, again, and I hadn't, honestly, I just put a bunch of kids to sleep. So I hadn't been following the latest news with the White House. But these are one of the worries that I've had. I've been pretty outspoken that I've been relatively sanguine here. I think I've had such a pessimistic view of the outcome of the strait remaining closed and of these facility attacks and of further escalation that I was confident that someone somewhere would have the wisdom to not go as far as it seems like the Trump administration may be willing to go here. If that is the case, then we're speed running kind of a risk far greater than that I've even described so far, and we could end up in like a truly disastrous situation where we have kind of a permanent downstructuring of the global energy economy. And just to kind of put in perspective, like let's say we use even 10 million. Let's just use the most conservative number available. I had another podcast episode very recently with Kareem Fawaz at S&P Global. And he and I kind of worked through a kind of a scenario discussion about what it would look like to destroy 10 million barrels a day of demand. And that is essentially like the total, the peak of demand loss in 2020 during COVID was 20 million barrels. Everyone was locked inside. There wasn't a plane in the sky, et cetera, et cetera. But on the year, the overall annual loss was about 8 million barrels. We're talking about a larger fundamental reduction than that that we could see mandated if this occurs. And most of at least the advanced world, you're going to require extraordinarily high prices to destroy that demand, which is why we will get extraordinarily high prices. But we will likely see this manifest in much of the global south and poorer economies as outright physical shortages, because someone's going to need to cut the demand, and it likely won't be the United States, Canada, where I'm at, Europe, or advanced and wealthy Asia. So we hear all the time, like if anyone that follows the oil market, we hear about like energy security. We hear about energy as life. We hear about all this stuff. And like sometimes it comes off as just like industry talking points. And I think often it is just industry talking points. But I think there is like a core truth here that when you so rapidly strip that volume of energy out, it will be a life or death question for millions, tens of millions of people. One of the things we've seen, one of the things that became a very acute early concern was Indian supplies of LPG, lots of which, basically all of which came from the Gulf. And LPG as a cooking fuel, basically propane, is one of the primary cooking fuels for a lot of rural India. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people. If you don't have access to those fuels, you will end up having to go to other dirtier, more polluting, less healthy, biomass alternatives. And again, these are like real human costs. Well, we could talk about the market impact, and I think the market impact will be immense. This will be, again, in that kind of situation, we're talking about like a deep, deep global recession, and I think depression for much of the world, even if it doesn't rise to that state, let's say in the West. And I think to your point earlier that I was not alive in the 70s. I am but a babe. But I do think that one of the advantages, particularly in the West, we have now versus the 70s, is that the oil intensity of our economies is vastly lower now than it was then. We produce a lot more and we do a lot more now with far less oil. So that shields us relative to those experiences. But you mentioned the even odd days. And I think we're seeing this in much of the world already, particularly in Asia. They're hunkering down. They see the wave coming. We're still, in North America, still pretty sanguine about this. I think most people you see around, on the road, like don't really appreciate the scale of the crisis they're facing. I always say it kind of feels like the early days of like January or February, early COVID, of like no one knows what's coming, and it's coming. But I think that for them, this is good. For the advanced economies, it's going to basically manifest as a deep, deep and unwelcome price shock, eroding disposable income. It'll kind of have all the normal recessionary things. But in much of the world, they will face physical shortages. And as I was saying, in Asia, that feels it most acutely. They're already preemptively making these types of even odd day policies, mandate government work from home. A lot of it is, a lot of the announcements sound very COVID-y, but for obviously very different reasons.
Well, what's fascinating about this is you see the up and coming economies, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, et cetera, being greatly impacted. I don't understand why Indonesia doesn't have more of a developed oil industry, something that's puzzled me because it was there in the 40s, it was there in the 30s, yet they have failed to sit there and exploit vast resources, a subject which I thought could have been invested in the future. But when you start going down the list of countries, India and Vietnam primarily to start, it's also causing a shift in alliances at a geopolitical level and disrupting everything that has been accomplished in the first year of the Trump administration and really disrupting the flow of commerce between Asia and the so-called first world to a point where it could have critical implications in our supply chains 3-6 months from now.
Yeah, I think that the geopolitics point, I think, is a particularly important one just to dwell on a second. I think what we had seen from at least the first year of the second term of the Trump administration was a much more aggressive, much more assertive, much more kinetic foreign policy, but one that was very much defined by kind of short, punchy moves. We saw the 12-day war and kind of nuclear attacks. We saw the Christmas attacks versus Boko Haram. We saw, obviously, in January, the removal and of Nicolas Maduro and effectively the kind of colonization of the Venezuelan oil industry. These, I think, from the vantage of Trump, these were very strong successes. I think they accomplished things both in terms of narrative and messaging, but also in terms of like in Venezuela's case, like tangible policy change. And that relatively, there was low political cost, there was low physical cost, there was low human cost. I think a lot of people saw those as pretty successful. And I said at the time, my worry was that it would make them cocky. And I think that's just what we've seen here. I think at the one thing I've held from the very beginning of the Iran war is that I do not think Trump meant to start the Iran war. I think he meant to do something similar. He got basically talked into it. My bet is by the Israelis, that this was going to be a quick, flashy, kill the supreme leader, wipe out the leadership. They would, the Iranians that were protesting would rise up and overthrow the government, and this would just cement Trump's legacy as the president that would use the U.S., the might of the U.S. military, to true effect. After kind of for so long, the view being that presidents were being a little too kind of namby-pamby with the might of the greatest military that the world has ever seen. And I think that impulse and that temptation does as all temptations do in all stories in all of history. It was too much of a good thing. And he got ahead of himself. He got over his skis, and then wham, bam, you end up in a kind of deep energy-related kind of war in the Middle East. Kind of the opposite, the Iran war is the polar opposite Trump thing that Trump has ever campaigned against. And I think this has been a point that's made ad nauseum, but like he campaigned against forever wars in the Middle East. He campaigned for cost of living kind of improvements, all of these things. And this has done the exact opposite. So it's bad for Trump. But now we're in a position where it's essentially a question of like, okay, how do you get out? And I think a big part of this is that unlike in Venezuela, where you had Delcy Rodriguez kind of appear as this kind of heir apparent and kind of very willing to deal very quick. I am convinced in my mind that Trump thought someone like that either the Iranian people would rise up, or you would have a kind of a wheeler and dealer emerge immediately. Neither of those things happened, and Trump does not seem. A lot of the reporting has seemed to like stress that Trump is like confused that the Iranians are not like he's like we destroyed their bridges. Why aren't they coming to the table? It's like, well, that's just not how they think about this, and that seemingly has kind of bamboozled, I think, some of his normal impulses. And now we're in the situation where like I keep saying like that the Iran war is fundamentally a crisis of lost time. It's really all we're talking about. Unless we go down the really bad path of those facility attacks, it's really just a question of how long the strait remains closed. And the longer we kind of dance around the central premise of like what it would take to satisfy Trump to get out, the worse it gets. And I've also kind of been pretty outspoken about the fact that I think that like the only way I see this ending really is what I call like the unilateral taco. And I think people, reasonably get a little iffy about the taco phrase. Let's just say the unilateral withdrawal. That Trump decides at some point to say, I'm done, I'm leaving, I'm bored. Like a lot of the reporting has literally said that Trump is bored by the Iran war. And I believe that. And I think that is going to be the impulse. Once the costs become too high, Trump is fundamentally a kind of a political animal. He'll see that and it's basically like bad TV ratings. He'll cancel the show. And but I think that so far, the costs of withdrawal to his reputation are still too high relative to the costs that he's facing. Because again, to the White House's credit, I guess, they have been extremely successful in talking down the price of oil, talking up the price of equities. I think this, the war has been 1 to 2 weeks to the end. For 4.5 weeks now. And the market keeps buying it. And to a degree, I keep buying it to a degree. Like that I do believe that as soon as the market prices get high enough, he will end this. And I think, but the challenge is it's the inevitable chicken and the egg situation where like, if we think that he's going to end it so the prices don't rise, then he's not going to end it. So it's the ultimate kind of Trump paradox. But that's, I think, the way this is going to have to end. And people will say, like, Rory, no, like there's, it takes 2 to taco or 3 to taco or whatever, because there are other people in the war, which is fair. But I don't believe that Israel will pursue this war along this path without the backing of the United States. They have tried before, and prior U.S. presidents have been able to basically not let this particular scenario occur. And Iran, sure, Iran's going to have post-war aspirations. We can talk about that. We can talk about the tolling. We can talk about this Oman deal, everything else. But fundamentally, they also do want to eventually stop being bombed. I think you will get action from them, and you will get like I think the fastest way you get any even like moderate volume of traffic back to the strait is this unilateral. Trump just stops bombing them one day, and that's what I think is going to happen. But I think that we're probably. I mean, clearly we haven't reached the low S&P levels we need, or the high oil prices and kind of domestic U.S. pump prices that we need to make this happen. But when that happens, that's how I see this going. I think, but we'll probably need to see WTI at kind of like 130, 140 before it ends up making that choice, which at this stage feels like it's going to be sometime in April.
That's a crisis that people I don't think are prepared for, because I think $5 unleaded just about wipes out 70% of the consumer and the disposable income they have available. Also, will kill Florida because travel's just going to get murdered. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, and we're starting to see the fuel surcharges hit. Amazon yesterday, United tonight added $10 per bag for fuel costs. The transportation industry, which is my background, the fuel surcharges are already skyrocketing. I don't think people understand that applies to railroads, containers. Every vessel that transport product has a fuel surcharge. And as those increase exponentially with the cost of diesel, the cost of bunker fuel, et cetera, it's going to hit the consumer where they're not expecting it. And that's the backside cost. And we're going to get into that in the second half hour. I wanted to throw this out about the situation at the Strait of Hormuz. And that is, we're hearing the constant rumor that they're paying in gold, yuan, cryptocurrency, whatever. But obviously the Iranians are taking payment to let vessels out. And whatever deal they cut with France has to have infuriated President Trump tonight, because the French were able to get some container ships out. We're starting to see people capitulate simply to get some of their vessels out of the firing zone before something bigger occurs. Do you think we'll see more of that in the next week, or do you think the action begins on the ground beforehand?
I definitely think you're going to see more ships try and make their way out. And again, I think it's important to think about Hormuz transit in kind of two waves, because this first wave, there are like at this stage, 2,000 ships still trapped in the Gulf that have not been able to exit for over a month. We're talking 20,000+ kind of seafarers trapped there with limited water, limited food, limited resources. Like, this is a humanitarian crisis on top of everything else that's happening kind of at the global level. There's going to be a huge incentive for those ships to get out. And I think you will see more and more deals, likely by governments of either the ship owners or the crews, to get those ships out. I think at that moment, there will be a lot of fanfare made about, oh, look, more and more ships getting through, and that will be good for those people. But I think that, like, as we saw, for instance, with the ships that crossed yesterday, there were 3 ships that crossed on the Omani side. Most indications are that Iran let that happen, probably based on some kind of bilateral deal with Oman. I think you're going to see more of that, but what we haven't seen is like a regular reestablished trade route. You're just seeing ships basically let go home, basically, let out of the captive pool. And I think that's going to be a very, very different thing. The other thing I just wanted to note was that you mentioned when we're talking, and you mentioned we're going to talk more about diesel on the other side of this. What was that? There was one other question you had. I apologize.
That's okay. I was looking for the consequences of the backside, the distillates, the condensates,
yes,
the byproducts. People don't seem to understand the large amount of byproducts that are produced from petroleum. I mean, I'll hit stories. This is a page I pulled up randomly called the Plastics Exchange. You could buy plastics product and bid on them. And okay, DPE film, common polymer, up 54% in 30 days. PP homopolymer, up 52.7%. PP copolymer, up 48.3%. HDPE blow mold, up 55.6%. What I don't think the average American citizen understands, with plastics averaging a 40% price increase across the board, these are the packaging products that come to your store, whether it's the grocery store shelf, the Dollar Tree, or the Walmart widget. It's products that you have to package, products that contain the goods you use every day. That's the hidden inflationary cost. And I'm not using inflation as a permanent embedded inflation, but it will raise the cost of goods regardless, no matter what we're being told by Kevin Hassett.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. I think we're seeing that effect across the product space very differently. Like so far, the biggest single point of failure, the biggest weakness, the biggest pain point is what we call the middle distillates. So that's diesel, gas, oil, jet fuel. Even in the first week of the crisis, we saw Singaporean jet fuel jump over $200 a barrel equivalent. We've seen $250 middle distillates in Asia over the past couple of weeks. Even in the US, in New York Harbor, we've seen crack spreads for US diesel prices versus Brent jump from around $30 at the beginning of the year to a high recently of 90, and currently was about 75 as of when I wrote my piece earlier today. That's really, really high. So if we're talking about you have like 110 Brent and you have $75 disti, or kind of diesel cracks, we're talking $185 equivalent diesel at the pump. That's the thing, to your point, that's going to hit everyone everywhere. That's the invisible one, right? Unless you have a diesel truck, which I always joke that like we needed to buy a bigger car for our family in 2021, and I traded a diesel kind of station wagon for a gas powered SUV, and I'm like, it's the best physical commodity trade I've ever made, because ever since I traded in that car, diesel has been like twice the price at the pump consistently. So that's always been. I always like to reflect on that personal good fortune. But that's, I think, while people will feel, and I think Trump will hear the political pain of price at the pump for gasoline, because that's going to be the most politically sensitive. That sneaky kind of inflationary side is going to be felt much more via diesel. And with jet fuel, we're seeing some of the most acute shortages in jet fuel, particularly in Asia. We're seeing huge cuts to flights. And that's where like part of that will be price, but part of that will just be physical shortage, that you're just physically will not have enough jet fuel for the normal amount of flights through Asia. On top of that, you're mentioning plastics. Again, most of in addition to crude oil, we also have a lot of gas condensates, natural gas liquids, and any kind of other light products coming out of the Gulf, particularly of the natural gas, like Qatar and Iran itself, kind of major gas producers. They've got a lot of these gas condensates and NGLs. A lot of those go to Asia for plastics production. So most of those light ends go to Asia, and then most of the middle distillates, diesel and jet fuel that the Middle East produces and exports, goes to Europe. It's been going to Europe to basically fill in the hole that was left when the EU banned the import of Russian products. So this has essentially left this Europe especially exposed on the distillates, and Asia especially exposed on the light ends. And that's something that's going to keep pressing. And yeah, we're going to feel it everywhere. The funny thing, the weird thing, let's say we need to destroy 10 million barrels of crude oil source demand in the world where we don't get this thing reopened anytime soon. The thing about it is that it can't all come from one product. It has to come across the product space kind of almost equivalently. Because when you're cracking and kind of producing products from your crude, you can't just get gasoline, you can't get just diesel, you get every product. So you're going to see shortages in each of these product markets, essentially proportional to the yield of those refineries out of those normal barrels. So that's the weird thing, is we're hitting everything kind of simultaneously, but each of those individual products is essentially like, so each one of those refined petroleum products, whether it's diesel, LPG or shipping fuel or whatever, each of them have their own supply demand balances, their own entire kind of industrial ecosystems, and their own price sensitivities. So each of these markets, and again, people like, what will this look like? What's your sensitivity? Like, what does the literature say? No one knows, because we've never tried to cut 10, 20 million barrels a day of demand from the global system. We have no idea what the elasticities are. This is entirely an active and kind of live natural experiment in the worst possible way.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, but this is one. Rory, we want you to advertise your product, your speakings, everything, websites, name it. We always offer this to our guests. We want you to sit there and publicize what you offer, because, folks, if you didn't hear Rory during the trade war beginning, the so-called Liberation Day, trust me, what's been happening since then, you start to build a case for how we're ending up in a mess far worse than we planned on. Please advertise yourself and promote everything you got.
Oh, well, thank you so much. So yeah, if anyone wants to follow my work, you should follow me here. And you should follow me on Substack at Commodity Context or commoditycontext.com. I have a paid service at that Substack. I write 3 different types of reports. Typically, I publish 2 reports weekly. Right now through the war, it's been more like 3 because there's been a lot of stuff going on. But I write 3 different types of reports. I write Oil Context Weekly every Friday between 4 and 5 p.m. Eastern. Basically wait for the final convinced traders data to come out and give it update on everything I'm following and everything I think that was important happened in the oil market that week. I have 3 different data decks or my kind of monthly data reports I publish, one on the global oil balances, one on North America, kind of industrial and trade detail, and one on the OPEC, both OPEC production, OPEC policy tracking, everything else. And I have a bunch of thematic work, which right now is all on the Iran war. Before that was all in Venezuela. And before that, I wrote a lot about Canadian pipelines. But really, whatever happens to be the thing that I'm following a lot that day and that month. So I encourage you to check that stuff out. I also encourage you to check out the podcast that I host called Oil Ground Up, hosted by the Clear Commodity Network. And I encourage you all to join me there and come join and dig for more context with me in the oil market.
Fantastic. And folks, for the macro picture, macroedge.net/ozone, macroedge.net/ozone. Get your 2-week free trial. Everything is being revamped. All of our data decks are being upgraded and expanded, and we will add some more communities for people to talk, serious people who want to do in-depth analysis of markets and market commentary. With that being said, I got to ask you, Roy, there's a myth that's out there about the SPR being the cure-all, end-all for the United States. It doesn't have the capacity to fill the gaps that we're seeing. And by statutory limits, I believe the lowest they can drain it down to is like 242 or 246 million barrels, because the rest of it is reserved for military purposes. At this point in time, President Trump is acting like this is going to cure everything. But the truth is, it was more to manipulate markets, would you not agree, than to actually have any material impact on supply.
I want to differentiate here briefly between what I will say I think about the Trump administration's execution of its release and the broader picture of the kind of the 400 million barrels of IEA coordinated emergency release, which, to be clear, while I disagree about the way that this war began, and I think the way it should be run, I do think from the viewpoint of the IEA as a kind of an energy security organizing agency, a massive, largest in history release of strategic stocks is exactly what should be done. This is literally the picture perfect moment for why these stocks were created in the first place, coming out of the 1970s oil shocks. Yes, absolutely. But to your point, they do not and they cannot keep up with the pace of the whole. I think that just in terms of size, total volume we're talking about, assuming the strait remains closed through the end of April, just the amount of oil not produced in April alone will equal the entire size of the 400 million barrel IEA coordinated release. So first and foremost, that's a lot of oil. But you can't pump it out that quickly. So when people talk about there are these kind of withdrawal limits, basically the physical capacity to dump that 400 million barrels, there are a lot of estimates out there as to exactly what that will be realized to be. In the US's case, Secretary Chris Wright had mentioned that the IEA's plan, the US DOE's plan was to release their 172 million barrels over 120 days. So if you use that same 120 days roughly for that entire 400 million barrel release, you get roughly 3.3 million barrels a day of release pace. That's the supply fill. It's the the drawdown pace is the offset for supply. So when we're talking about a 13 million barrel a day supply loss, we're talking about a 3.3 million barrel a day, IEA emergency SPR offset. Obviously, it's just a very, very small piece of this whole. I should note that 3.3 million barrels a day of emergency release supply swing is very truly massive. Like that is, I just can't state enough that is a very, very large amount of oil. That is larger than the feared supply loss from Russia in 2022. It's a huge amount of oil. It's just the Hormuz crisis is so large, it makes everything else look puny, even things that in their own right are massive. But yes, it will not offset. It will just be a piece of the pie. And again, it's what should be done. It's an important piece of this. It's one of the only things that importing nations can do. But yes, it is just a tiny offset, and we will need to see this come down largely at the end of the day to commercial stocks, which will, and when you start whittling down commercial stocks, that's when this really becomes more of a forced pricing mechanism. Whereas the strategic stocks, their purpose is basically to blunt that effect on the commercial stocks. The other thing that the U.S. has done is they've basically gone absolutely helter-skelter trying to unwind sanctions on both Russia and, yes, even Iran itself, and basically allowing what had been built up as excess oil and water driven by these sanctions. Basically, essentially, the marketing difficulties backed this stuff up on water. There were roughly probably about 100 million barrels between Iran and Russia built up surplus. Those were also going to draw down over the first month or two. Those have largely already drawn down a fair amount. And as we enter the second month, we're going to have less and less of that cover. And that as those more temporary offsets fall off, that's when, again, the pricing pressure is going to become greater because you're going to fall ever more heavily on commercial stocks. The final thing I'll say just about the strategic release is that the U.S. policy and the way they've managed it is interesting. So I see Arnab Datta in the audience here, and he and I have worked a lot in the past on the SPR and how you could best structure, basically taking advantage of the extreme backwardation in the market. And back during the Biden administration, we worked on a bunch of pieces around how you could essentially sell heavily into spot, because again, what we feel as consumers, the main concern for government is the impact on consumers, the impact on inflation, the impact on inflation expectations, particularly during a broader inflationary shock that we saw in 2022. That I think is you sell heavy into spot to reduce the spot pressure, but then you also want to refill this at some point, right? And you want to kind of figure out the best way to kind of use that heavy kind of intertemporal arbitrage to your advantage. So you can basically buy back with fixed contracts way down the curve and basically refill a larger amount at the same time. The thing is that the Trump administration did not like these policy ideas because the Biden administration actually did move to actually operationalize them through a rulemaking procedure. They did not like that. They basically ripped up that rule and said, we're going back to the old way. Now, however, we end up in very predictably almost the exact crisis envisioned by that type of policy structure. And to achieve basically the exact same thing, because they don't want to, after giving the Biden administration so much grief about the drawdown during Russia, they don't want to be seen as drawing down the SPR. So what they've done is they have entirely structured their release as an exchange. So there's a policy where you can basically exchange the barrels, and the DOE, Department of Energy, gets back barrels in kind as interest. So basically, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but basically the US SPR would lend out, it would sell out kind of 172 million barrels, and they would get something like 200 or 210 million barrels back on the other side. The challenge is that when you think about the purpose of the SPR in this moment, the purpose is to get barrels as quickly out the door as possible in an emergency. Anything that you do to complicate that on the counterparty receiving, kind of the person receiving those barrels end. And in this case, what they would need to do is if they received the barrel, then they would need to commit to a volumetric increased return barrel some period later, which means they would need to go to the market. They would need to try and secure that, hedge that, operationalize all that system. And what they ended up finding was that they end up for the first half that they tried to do, they only actually awarded half of that volume. So out of that total, what we're seeing is because of those complications, those barrels are not getting out the door as quickly. So I would say that in terms of marks, I understand why they did it that way. Again, it's a similar kind of idea about using the curve to your advantage, but you're trying to push way too much onto the counterparties rather than actually taking more of that on yourself. And again, you're the government in this case. Your job is to be is to be managing this crisis. And I think trying to pass that off to kind of avoid the political exposure about drawing down the SPR again in a crisis that it's perfectly imagined for, I think is kind of weaselly.
I cannot agree more. It is very Weasley, and I also think that it's going to leave us quite vulnerable in the future, especially when we'll have to refill it at a substantially higher price level than what we're seeing. And that brings us back to the entire discussion about distillates, et cetera, diesel, everything we're going to talk about. I don't think people understand the processing of a barrel of crude oil. And diesel, while it's considered a dirty fuel like bunker fuel, does have a necessary part in our supply chain. And with Russia threatening to withhold, China banning exports except to a few key allies, we're starting to see a tightening of that supply market. In fact, ammonia today, Russia put a ban on exports of ammonia. We've already lost 20% from the Gulf. When you start adding this up, the domino effects of all of the other byproducts really does have a major impact on global economic production and increasing. It really could cause that pullback that you were discussing. And that is the risk factor. There's too many people don't understand the difference between futures and physical available barrels for processing.
Totally. And again, I keep coming back to the fact that like the people I know who understand these sectors most are the most pessimistic. And again, these are normally the most reasonable, like don't be an alarmist, don't get over your skis kind of situation type people. These are the people that are like literally like morbidly panicked right now. They do not understand. These are people that like their job is to basically reconcile these markets, and like they don't reconcile. They just are broken. Like I don't know how to fix this. That's the kind of situation. If the strait remains closed, it's just it's too big to fail. It's too big to remain closed. Um, when we try and imagine what that world looks like, it's just again, it's a much poorer, much less mobile, much less energy secure society on the other side of this. So that's why again, my pessimism leads me to the optimism that this will wrap sometime soon. But again, I've been wrong thus far because so far the market prices have not forced this fact for the White House. And again, I think they're going to have to. I think in some ways that really crazy rally we saw in WTI this week was the first sign where like you could very much tell like immediately you could tell like White House comms got a little bit more cagey. Like again, oh, this isn't the European Brent stuff. This is that good American oil that's all of a sudden, the center point of the global crisis. And just again, for those that didn't see that spike this week, again, crazy. We had at one point $15 barrel, $15 a barrel backwardation in prompt WTI. So that's a $15 a barrel spread between the front prompt contract in the WTI futures curve and the second month. That is an insane record. And given that we were only partway through the month, that means basically if you had a physical barrel of oil in Cushing, Oklahoma, and you rented it out, you basically sold that barrel and bought it the same barrel back the next month. You could basically earn a risk-free 25% in term, on a monthly basis. That's crazy. Like that's just how tight and crazy wild this market is. That has to, the only thing that fixes that is an erosion of demand or a new source of supply, because this is basically just going to keep ripping down inventories in a way until that there just aren't any left. And we've seen that across every benchmark. We've seen record backwardation in Brent, record backwardation in WTI, record backwardation in Dubai crude. We saw yesterday, we saw a dated Brent, the kind of spot price marker that prices so many barrels globally, hit $141 a barrel for the first time since the highest level since 2008. The thing that I think is weird about this crisis, and again, I think this partially goes back to the combination of the extreme intensity of it and the fact that it keeps being presumed that it's going to be short-lived. has meant that the entire crisis is basically manifested at the very, very front of the futures curve. That's made this kind of really, really spiky. But because when most of us are looking at prices on a screen, what we're seeing is the front month futures contract for a barrel 2 months ahead of time often. So it's playing out in prices that most people aren't seeing, but you're going to feel at the pump much more than you're seeing on your screen. It's also part of the reason why one thing that everyone was commenting on this week was that at one point, prompt WTI was trading at a premium to prompt Brent. Very strange, particularly given the fact that WTI had been at such a big discount previously. But the issue is that WTI and Brent have different delivery month rules. So right now, for instance, WTI is trading May barrels and Brent is trading June barrels. So what you're seeing there is essentially just another manifestation of that same extreme backwardation, that extreme premiums faced at the front of the curve for immediate delivery. And again, I think that's people are like, oh, that means it's just going to be over. I think there's an element there of the market maybe thinking that. But what it's really just telling you is how insanely tight the current spot market is.
That being said, if you look at the bigger picture here, there's news that also occurred. I haven't even had a chance to talk to you about this. You were talking about Trump looking for his taco, his stuffed taco that he sleeps on with every night, so to speak, or that little dog from the Taco Bell commercials of a classic era. When you look at what happened, we lost two A-10s, an F-15, an F-16 was shot up pretty bad and had to crash land in Saudi Arabia. Two Blackhawks were shot up with wounded on board. This is an escalation when American airmen and troops on the ground are getting hit on a regular basis. It seems antithetical that Trump would actually sit there and stop now. He will feel the need to punish because of his ego. And that increase in intensity is what I'm worried about. For him to stay in D.C. this weekend and to push for a higher or greater increase in intensity, possibly including ground troops, is the most dangerous risk that I don't think is priced into the forward months or the backward months. The back end of the curve. Yeah. It's a high risk proposition.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I don't think even the current reality is priced into the curve fully, but I definitely agree that risk is not priced in, and the risk of that being realized is not priced in. So I think that, yeah, I saw the news about the jet shot down and the Blackhawks. I believe that both the pilots for the jets had been successfully and safely recovered. I did not see any news about the Blackhawk crews. Did you have any news about those?
There's only one that's been recovered as of 8:00 tonight. The other, yeah, that's what I'm saying too. It's a very touchy situation.
Yeah,
and Trump immediately canceled all his press conferences after that happened. So he's shut down the White House. He's basically put a lid on everything and locked it down. But what's more interesting is we hear about the invulnerability, but people seem to forget Russia and China are testing their weapons in Iran also. So we're beginning to get an exposure as to what the rest of the world has been up to. It's pretty terrifying when you hit his ego. He wants to hit back harder, and that's what he said, not me. That's his tradition throughout life.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a good place. And again, I think that it really comes down to this question of like this the unstoppable force versus immovable object, of like his distaste for doing complicated and unpopular things and his desire for revenge. They're basically going to jam against each other here, because you're not going to be able to get one. You're not going to be able to get both. You're going to have to choose one. I think increasingly that you're right. I think particularly after the speech on Wednesday night, I think that we didn't learn anything new from the speech, but what we saw confirmed was essentially a lot of that same thing, that he thought that he could get away with getting more and deeper and further escalation in the crisis. Mixed with this, I think you're right. I think my base case is slipping to a deeper, darker place about how long this conflict could go on. And yeah, that's going to mean really, really bad things. Because again, if the best case scenario right now is that we lose 1 billion barrels, well, all the other scenarios are much, much worse. And again, I think my fear is something, if Trump tries to take Kharg Island, That's where Iran would just start hitting things much more permanently, or at least as permanently as you get in the oil market. Shifting this kind of recovery from a matter of weeks or months to years. And if the world needs to do without big chunks of Gulf production for years, that's going to be both extraordinarily painful. It's going to have really bizarre kind of geopolitical consequences. One thing you had mentioned this earlier that I kind of didn't really circle back to effectively, and I meant to, was their comment about the geopolitics of this, because I think that the way you're seeing, for instance, like, Prime Minister Modi directly talking with people in Tehran in order to secure Indian LPG tankers, and like, I think there's when this war began, it was basically clear that Iran just wanted to survive. That was its entire victory condition, was if the regime could survive, it won. Now it seems to be that they're trying to figure out a way to benefit from this. Like, we were thrust into the situation. How can we come out on the other side having gained something? And again, who knows? I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that the United States and Israel can achieve regime change in Iran with enough time. That's not really a question for me, but I just don't think anyone's willing to pay that time cost. So in the meantime, if Iran believes it can kind of pull through, survive, and then pull out the other side, maybe with some kind of durable control of the strait, which is what they've been consistently talking about. You've seen this discussion of some kind of protocol agreement with Oman that they can kind of jointly monitor and arrange ships out of the Gulf. I think there's been a lot of people that have said, like, this is impossible. The Gulf states would never accept it, etc. I don't think it would be politically stable. I think it would be inherently unstable and prone to blow up. But I think that the current situation is also inherently unsustainable. So yeah, Iran charging a $2 million kind of passage fee is unpopular, bad, unstable, etc., likely to cause more problems. But relative to the current position of no one getting their stuff out, $1 a barrel on a VLCC, it seems like a fairly small price to pay to basically resume your main industry's kind of lifeblood. So I do think that there's a world here where Iran went from this kind of, like, at least from the oil market perspective, this kind of intermittent storyline in the oil market to becoming a very major player on the other side of this in a way that I don't think any of us are really prepared for. It adds like this meta layer to OPEC policy and supply that has never existed before, in a way that, again, I don't think anyone knows what that's going to look like.
It's fascinating because we've seen no attacks in eastern Iran on the railway that links Iran to China, which in a war you would think that would be a key strategic point of attack. So instead, the attacks have been on oil infrastructure, water infrastructure, etc. At this point in time, I got to ask a big question, because I don't want to abuse your time. I don't know how much time you have with us tonight, so I'm just going to go into a few things real quick. People have not paid attention to tanker rates, which are at historic highs. But also a bigger thing that people are ignoring. Let's assume your good case scenario, we end the war at the end of this month.
Mm-hmm.
The refineries and processing facilities that have been damaged from Iraq to Oman, and especially the UAE and Qatar, who have taken a beating, absolute beating, is so severe. I'm hearing numbers like 6, 9, and 12 months to bring some of them back online, which doesn't do anything to alleviate the shortages that exist during the war. So the sunshine and lollipop scenario, everything's going to be fine the minute there's peace, doesn't seem realistic. Please let me know.
Yeah, and just to your first question, I probably should wrap here pretty shortly after this question, but
no problem. That's fine.
But I really appreciate you guys having me on. But I think to this question, I think you're right. I think one of the things that we're all pretending is that we know what the recovery looks like. The answer is, like, I'm sure you're in this industry as well. Keeping up with the news flow alone has been impossible, let alone actually validating, verifying everything on the ground. It's like literally impossible. We are not going to know what these recoveries are going to look like at either the field level or the refinery and processing level, as you note, until we actually try and turn this stuff back on. And it's only after that process are we going to actually see, because I think people are always worried about production shut-ins because of reservoir pressure losses or other complications. I think that could be an issue here, but I think the benefit is that of any place in the world to forcibly shut in production, the kind of core of OPEC are the people that are kind of best at doing that. So I think that they should be pretty good at getting most of this back online. But to your point, we don't know. We don't really know what has actually been hit. The other thing is that many of these countries, the Gulf states, are also extremely secretive with what has been damaged and what we and kind of trying to put on their own kind of brave faces and kind of like steely resolves here that they don't want to show how much that they've been wounded in various areas as well. So there's just a lot of double talk, a lot of kind of obfuscation. And yeah, we're not going to know what this looks like until it's back online. So we can, if anyone wants to check out my piece from yesterday on the billion-barrel cost of the longer Iran war, it kind of assumes, again, optimistically, a very nice kind of exponential recovery in these kind of shut-in wells. But we could get something that's much stickier, much kind of more mismatched across producers, which we probably will. And I think we'll end up in a situation that's not nearly as clean or as pretty. And I also think that there's, in my mind, I also model essentially a complete recovery over the course of 3 months. I think there's a reasonably high chance that we don't get that some of this production just doesn't come back ever, or at least no time soon. The example we know, again, I mentioned the attack on Qatar's the Qatar LNG facilities, Ras Laffan, that's the name. Anyways, the Qatar Energy CEO had mentioned that to Reuters, had basically said that was a 17% reduction in Qatar's LNG export capacity for up to 5 years. That's the kind of thing where, again, when this really goes off the rails is when missiles start pounding into the actual production and shipping facilities. So far, that still mostly hasn't happened, and Iran has shown a willingness and a capacity to do that at basically a moment's notice. So, I guess we're all going to see what President Trump is up to at the White House, and if we're all going to have it all a relaxing Easter weekend. So, with that, I wish everyone a very, very happy Easter weekend, and thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks for having me on the call.
Rory, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And by the way, hopefully your Toronto Maple Leafs hire a decent general manager. We like the competition down here in Tampa, believe it or not. Folks, I know it's a hockey thing. You'll understand someday. Hockey is the religion of many of us. Thank you so much. CommodityContext.com, folks, and also MacroEdge.net/Ozone. My 2 cents in this: watch Keshem Island. It's a small island in the Strait of Hormuz. It's Iranian territory. It makes Gallipoli look like a Sunday morning picnic. For MacroEdge.net, this is John Galt speaking. Good night now.